Aloha mai kako. We are so grateful to be sharing space with all of you today for our very special AAPI Heritage Month screening. This is The Way We Rise and conversation with Dr. Jamaica Heolimeleikalani Osorio. This event is brought to you by the UC Berkeley Asian American and Pacific Islander Standing Committee, which I am a student representative on, and we are very excited to be in partnership with the Pacific Islander Initiative and Pacific Islanders at Cal to make this event possible today. My name is Lily Brosas. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a third-year undergraduate student here at Cal in the Social Welfare and Legal Studies departments. I am from Long Beach, California, and my mother's side of the family has its roots in Hilo, Hawaii. I'm honored to be your moderator tonight alongside Carly, and I will pass it off to her to introduce herself.
Thank you, Lily. Aloha no, o no lani ku'i no Hawaii, no o ahu maiau, no noho auma Moana. Hi, everyone. My name is Carly Noelani Kajiwara. I am from Moanalua, Oahu, but I have family roots on the islands of Kauai and Hawaii Island. I use the she, her pronouns, and I graduated from Kamehameha Kapalama in 2017, and I am now a graduating senior studying psychology and creative writing. I am also the community liaison for the PI initiative, and we're so excited to hold space and community with y'all today. So thank you, Lily.
Before we start our programming, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. I want to begin by recognizing that while we gather virtually as a community of UC Berkeley, that the university itself sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone people, successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Moekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. As Pacific Islanders, as a Kanaka Maoli, it is our deep sense of connection to our roots and to the oceans and lands that connects us to the Ohlone peoples that calls me to recognize the original stewards of the lands that we benefit from. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. We recognize that this history is not behind us and that the Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley community and broader Bay Area communities today. We offer this land acknowledgement to affirm Indigenous sovereignty and also to remember who exactly we want to return this land to as we hold ourselves, others, and the University of California, Berkeley more accountable to Indigenous sovereignty. In the chat, we are going to provide some more resources for you to learn about the Ohlone people or the people whose land you are a settler on, and some direct action that you can take to support their rematriation and sovereignty efforts. Now I'm going to pass it off to Carly, who's going to give us a little bit of a background on TMT and the significance of Mauna Kea to our people, and some helpful vocabulary to understand before we watch the film, and then we'll watch the film.
Wonderful, thank you. Before we begin, I just wanted to make a quick note to stress or emphasize that I'm not a kumu nor an expert in any way. I haven't had any formal training or academic research on these topics. What we're sharing today is just what we know from our community and from our families. So thank you. Please go to the next slide. Awesome. So Mauna Kea, for those of you who don't know, who are coming into this conversation just today, is the Pico of the islands and the beginning of end to all life. It's the meeting point of the earth realm and the heavens. We believe it's where Papa, the Earth Mother, and Wakea, the Sky Father, meet. So it's the realm of gods. Obviously, it's very sacred. Many families have shrines on top of Mauna Kea, and it's the jumping off point for spirits into the heavens. So my family has taught me that when a kupuna or an ancestor dies, they make this great trek up the mountain, and when they reach the top, they jump into the heavens, and that's kind of difficult to do with a bunch of telescopes on top of it. From its base, which is below sea level, it is taller than Mount Everest, and there's also snow on the mountain, so it also is a watershed for the island of Hawaii. Next slide, please. So this slide is saying 13. So that's how many telescopes are already on Mauna Kea without the permission of the Native Hawaiian people. And we also want to note that the University of California has currently invested $68 million into TMT as of April 2020. And I also wanted to highlight that these two pictures here are my personal pictures. I took them when I had the privilege and honor of going up on top of the mountain maybe 2 summers ago. And it was one of the most significant and amazing experiences of my life to be on top of there. So I can personally affirm as well that it's so sacred and just pristine and peaceful. So next slide, please. These are some resources and videos that we have compiled for y'all. The first one, pu'uhuluhulu.com, is a great resource for protocol, for the ongoing fight, for Kapu Aloha resources. So I highly recommend checking those out if you have time. I believe we'll share them in the chat below. CA for Mauna Kea, or California for Mauna Kea, is also a great website for what you can do locally in California and how you can petition for the university to divest from TMT. Personally, I am also a great video, visual, audio learner. So we've included some videos here. There's the Jason Momoa video, a short speech from Lanakila, and then a short PBS documentary video as well. All wonderful videos that I highly recommend watching after this or when you have time. Next slide, please. Okay, this is some useful vocabulary, and I also wanted to put a note in here on the deeper meaning of Aloha Hawaii. There's no way that we can describe or define words or in a language, just from this one slide, but I think it's helpful as we're watching the video and as we're having these discussions, these words may come up. So if you aren't familiar with Aloha Hawaii, please go ahead and take a screenshot now to refer to later, or copy these words down so you know some vocabulary as we're going through. For short, Mauna is mountain, Kanaka is a native Hawaiian, Lahui means group, but we usually use it to refer to the larger Hawaiian community. ʻＡina is land, or that which feeds and nurtures us. Aloha ʻāina is love for the land, or love for that which feeds and nurtures us and giving back to the land. Mele means songs. Kapuloha, which is a really big term, and it's for respect, gracious love, and so much more. It's a way that we conduct ourselves, and some of the other links that we have earlier kind of further explain Kapuloha. But Pono also means good and righteous. Moʻolelo is a story or legend. A kupuna is an elder or an ancestor, and a kiaʻi is a protector. So if you get the chance, please screenshot this now, write them down, because we will be using these terms throughout the program. And that's it. Thank you. Pule. So I'll start with Kumu Renee Price. She was born on the island of Oahu, the youngest of 7 children. Renee learned the art of hula from an early age from her mother, Esther Ku'ulenani Carrera, who had taught hula since the 1940s in Hawaii. At the age of 5, she moved with her family to San Mateo, California, where her mother opened a hula halau, or school, in 1960. Hula halau o ku'ulenani, which she eventually would take over upon her mother's retirement. In addition to being a kumu hula, Renee also serves as a cultural practitioner of Hawaiian arts and crafts and Hawaiian studies, a composer, a cultural advisor for several art and hula schools in Northern California, and a Hawaiian concert promoter and stage manager. Her formal career path has included work in human resources, scheduling and planning management, training management, project analysis, and financial and project management for the Bureau of Land Management within the Department of the Interior. I'm now going to pass it on to Stephen Kanani Madaris, a Kanaka Maoli graduate student studying public policy at UC Berkeley, to introduce our next kumu.
Mahalo, Carly. It's my honor to introduce Kumu Kau Peralto. Kumu Kau is a native Hawaiian, Chinese, and Caucasian guest residing on Ohlone territory, who's a passionate community organizer, educator, social justice advocate, ʻāina warrior, and Mauna Kea kiaʻi. She lives her culture and believes in the traditions and power of indigenous knowledge to be a source of wisdom in contemporary discussions. Kumu Kau also believes that our words are not only that which is spoken, but also that which flows through our beings and unites with our environment. So if they want, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, you want me to start?
Yeah, thank you.
I think Kumu Kau is having a hard time getting in. I'm not sure on her end, so I don't know. Okay, sorry. Oh, Heolimeleikalani Kumu Kai, Kaipa hola mai kama lama lama. Mai Hawaii a kamoleo lehua, ua ma ama ama, mai uka ai kai, kilipohe ka lehua mamo I o laa, laha ka I lima kuka hakai o haena, Ha'amai ke kinipua ke kulauloa I ka oa he ahe. O ka makani he mua e. A he lei vehi ia no Hawaii ia puni. Pui a ka ʻāina. I ke ala o kuʻule nani e. I'll open the space for blessings with a homai if anybody wants, all of you want to join. I don't see Kaui. E homai kai ke mai luna mai e. O na mea huna no e au. O na mele e homai. E homai, e homai, e homai, kai ke mai luna mai e. O na mea huna no e au. O na mele e homai, e homai, e homai, e homai kai ke mai luna mai e. O na mea huna no e au. O na mele e homai, e homai, e homai e. Hola. Oh, yay.
Yay! Okay, so aloha. Aloha mai kako. Sorry it took me a while to get on. Okay, so can everybody hear me? Okay, mahalo. Where's our Heoli? Sorry, I can't see Heoli. Hi, Heoli.
Aloha.
Aloha. Mai ka'i, mai ka'i.
Mai kai ike ana ia oi.
O waupu. Mahalo, mahalo no ka hele ana mai I anei. So e pule kako. Mahalo ya oko no keia la nani no na mea I hoʻomaikai ia ia mākou pākahi a pau. Oia no o Heolimeleikalani Osorio kamakawiwa ole. Mahalo nui no na aumakua no kona hele mai ana no kona alo I anei. Mahalo no ka makana ya oi e haoli, Heoli. Mahalo pu no ko noho ana me mākou I keia la. Mahalo no ka lokahi no ka mea kaulana. No na mea ku e. No na mea I ʻōlelo. Mahalo ia oi no ka hoʻolohe ia mākou ia oi. Ike mākou ia oi. Ku e no mākou me oi. Mahalo no ke ka hapai ana ia mākou a pau. So mahalo ke akua no na aumakua, na lehu na kini akua. Mahalo pu, mahalo. Aloha.
Oh, mahalo, mahalo, mahalo.
Mahalo to our Kumu. Thank you so much for that beautiful pule. We're going to go ahead and get started now with our question portion, if that's okay with everybody. I'm so honored to introduce Dr. Jamaica Heolimeleikalani Osorio, a Kanaka Maoli wahine artist, activist, scholar, feature of the documentary This is the Way We Rise, and our esteemed guest today. Dr. Osorio was born and raised in Pālolo Valley to parents Jonathan and Mary Osorio. She earned her PhD in English Hawaiian literature in 2018 from the University of Hawaiʻi at Mānoa, where she is currently an assistant professor of Indigenous and Native Hawaiian politics. Dr. Osorio is a 3-time national poetry champion, poetry mentor, and published author. She is a proud past Kaiāpuni student, Ford Fellow, and graduate of Kamehameha, Stanford, and New York University. Her book, Remembering Our Intimacies, Moʻolelo, Aloha, ʻāina, and ʻea, is forthcoming with the University of Minnesota Press in fall 2021, which I can't wait to read. And Dr. Osorio, we are so honored to have you with us, and I want to pass it over to you to introduce yourself a little bit before Carly asks our first question.
Awesome. Mahalo for that wonderful introduction, and mahalo to Kumu Renee Price and Kumu Kau for that oli and that Pule to bring us into this space together. Like Lily said, my name is Jamaica Heolimeleikalani Osorio. Most people these days just call me Heoli. It's easier. I'm a kupa, he kupa no ka ʻāina o Pālolo, ka ua lile hua a me ka makani wai o ma'o. Ka ike manawa no wau ma wahiawa, ka piko o Oahu Alua. I was born and raised under the Lililehua rain and the White Oma'o winds in Pālolo Valley, which I once believed was the center of the universe, until I moved, of course, to Wahiawa Oahu, which is literally like the piko of the island that I live on Oahu Alua. Like Lily said, I am a professor of Indigenous and Native Hawaiian politics, which is a fancy way of saying that I spend a lot of time thinking about what it means to be Indigenous and what it means to struggle against our occupiers and settler states, and what it means to build solidarity across our shared struggles, but also across our incredible differences. That's pretty much what I spend most of my time doing is thinking and talking about that. The rest of my time I spent reading Moʻolelo, usually really old Moʻolelo literatures and histories of my people, stuff that was told for thousands of generations and then written down in Hawaiian language newspapers in the 19th and 20th centuries. Almost all of my academic work looks very closely at how Oiwi, Indigenous, and in particular Hawaiian pilina, this thing, as the film says, called intimacy and relatedness, how those norms of intimacy have been transformed and dismembered through colonialism. As like a wahine who loves other wahine, I look both specifically at what this means for kind of conventional and Indigenous queer theories, but also just generally what it means to create community in a way that is Indigenous. How we imagine governance in a way that is Indigenous, that resonates with both our people and our land. Yeah, that's pretty much all you need to know about me. I like books, and I like the ocean, and I like talking to other dope Indigenous women and people of color. So I'm happy to be here and to be having these conversations with you folks today.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Osorio. We're now going to move on to the questions, and this evening we have a few questions about your role in the ongoing fight to protect Mauna Kea, as well as your experiences as a Kanaka Maoli in academia. And we have a few prepared questions from our student leaders, as well as some questions the attendees have submitted. So our first question is, since you were there from the very beginning, even before the day you and others chained yourselves to the cattle grate, what was it like for you to see our Lahui rising?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And to kind of contextualize the question, right? So I was really fortunate to be at Pu'uhuluhulu from before we established a Pu'uhonua, which you kind of saw happening in the film. But this was not the first occupation to protect Mauna Kea, right? There was an occupation in 2015. There were confrontations in 2014. Hawaiians, in particular, Hawaiians on Hawaii Island have been fighting to protect our Mauna since the late 1960s. And I say that for a few reasons. The first is that we've been really great in developing our own media strategy in the last 2 years, that a lot of new people have learned about this movement against this movement to protect our Mauna, but not so many people have learned how long some of our kupuna and makua have been doing this work. And so in 2019, this was my first time actually coming to the Mauna and putting my body in line to protect the Mauna. And when we first got there that first night, there were like 30 people in a parking lot. I don't know how many of you folks have been to Pu'uhuluhulu and the parking lot across the street from the Mauna Kea access road. But to be completely honest, I think most of us who were there that night were really worried that no one else would come. We knew that people loved the Mauna. We knew that our people loved each other. But you were asking a lot of people to kind of pick up their lives and come move to one of the most, at least from a climate perspective, one of the most unwelcoming places in Hawaii. In fact, in many places around the world. So each day to watch our lahui grow was really magnificent. At first, we saw a lot of faces we were familiar with, right? We saw friends who had struggled with us back home. We saw the people who we already knew were kind of radicalized, right? They had already been talking about Mauna Kea. They'd already been thinking about the violence of TMT and overdevelopment and the relationship between colonialism and science. But with each day that passed, we started to see more and more people that we didn't know, or more people that we never expected would have come. And to me, that was the most amazing thing about the Pu'uhonua at Pu'uhuluhulu is how it opened the door for so many more people to step into the lahui, to step into our community, and so many more settlers and allies to come and show their solidarity in a really meaningful way. And I don't think, there were, in the early days when we didn't know how big this would be, I don't think anyone imagined that any given day there would be 5,000 to 7,000 people living in a parking lot. Like stepping away from their jobs and stepping away from their families and giving their lives to the protection of the Mauna. So that was a huge gift to be able to witness that in person, because the last time our lahui stepped up to protect the Mauna in 2015, I wasn't there. And I experienced that show of Aloha ʻāina through my phone and through Facebook, the way that many people did in 2019. So to feel the difference of that was really, really powerful.
Thank you so much. I know I wish I could have been there, and I know even in Berkeley, feeling that feeling of every day the protesting on Sproul, which is our main part of campus, and how every day a few more people showed up and a few more people were like, hey, what's this about? And you could talk story with people and learn, and it's a very beautiful, powerful thing to experience, even from miles across the ocean. So our next question, I wanted to talk about your poetry. One of my favorite lines in the documentary is that a poem is only as good as it resonates. I personally resonate with so many of your poems, and I have heard it said that when you get emotional hearing our language spoken and chanted and sung, is because our ancestors are speaking through us and speaking through others. And I wanted to ask how you feel your ancestors speaking through you and your poetry, and how has drawing inspiration from the Mauna influenced your poetry and your connection to our lahui and the Mauna?
That's a great question. Your question is making me think about something that Havane Rios has said a number of times in my presence. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Havane, she's one of the people who've been protecting Mauna Kea her whole life. But she said recently in a conversation we were having that when you see us chanting or when you see us singing, that's only possible because someone somewhere never stopped chanting, never stopped singing, never stopped dancing hula, never stopped protecting our ʻāina. And so when I think about the question of like, how are my ancestors speaking through me, there, of course, there's a part of this work that has nothing to do with me, right? Sometimes you write a poem and you have no idea where it came from. Sometimes you write a poem, you don't even remember writing the poem. And so there's a bit of like ancestral intervention there, but there's also this really obvious material truth that I would not be writing these poems if there weren't kupuna all around me who never stopped fighting, right? Who never stopped showing up, who never stopped insisting that we have a right as Maoli people, as Oiwi people, as Indigenous people, to live in humanity with our ʻāina, with that which feeds us. So on that note, everything I write is a love letter to my ancestors. And I think that's one of the reasons that people find resonance with the poetry that I write, because I think people are waking up to reestablishing those relationships with their ancestors. And so I try really hard to take that kuleana, that responsibility and immense privilege really seriously, right? There's a part of like this Western tradition of literature, and actually just Western tradition of everything, period, to think about things in terms of ownership, right? Like, this is my property, my intellectual property, my creative property. But that would really sever the relationship between why I'm writing and who is allowing me to write, and like what the purpose of this writing is. And so to open up yourself to the understanding that that to write is to be given a gift. And so what you produce therefore has to also be a gift to the people who are making that possible. And so that's why I think, that's my connection between my poetry and the Mauna and any movement that I participate in, that that like remembering all of those connections. And then the other thing I'll say is like, another reason that I'm able to write these poems is because somewhere is in the kitchen tent washing dishes, right? Like, someone is cleaning up the porta potties, someone is taking care of hale ho'olako, or like Kanaka Costco, right? There's all this other labor that's happening that allows me to like take a step away from that labor and write a poem. And so I think it's really important, especially as like artists who are in movement, to recognize the labor that's happening that is allowing you to create this art. And even more so, then you need to like release the ownership of this work, that it is like a collective labor that has allowed it to be.
Thank you. So our next question, shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about the role of the police on the Mauna. Yeah, just shift it real quick from that beautiful, beautiful aspect of your poetry. Just, I've heard so much and seen so much, and the documentary touched on it a little bit, but just the tactics they use and the use of Kanaka police to conduct the arrest of our kupuna, and their unwillingness to meet the kia'i on their demands, and the overall violence that they perpetuate day in and day out. And I wanted to know if you can speak a little bit about the role of the police on the Mauna, your firsthand personal experience, and maybe how it parallels calls from the Black Lives Matter movement to defund and abolish policing, and if you want to talk about the movement to protect the Mauna as a movement of abolition.
Yes. Okay, this is a huge question. How much time we got? Okay, cool. So not everyone's gonna like what I have to say about this, which is important to recognize before I get into any of this. I believe the movement to protect Mauna Kea, in particular, in retrospect, as I'm looking back on 2 years, I believe the movement is an abolitionist movement. But most people who were there probably don't agree with that statement. So I'll just put that out there, right? So this is like a pretty controversial thing to say, yada, yada, yada. I like being controversial, it's fine. At the foundation, police departments, policing is violent. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter if the police officer is crying as they're carrying the kupuna away from their land for the movement of construction vehicles. Like, policing is a violent institution. And there's been a lot of discussion on how policing in Hawaii is different than on Turtle Island. And I am one of those people who have talked specifically about how policing is different. But I think some of us, myself included, may have missed the point in that discussion, which is to say, yes, unlike on Turtle Island, specifically unlike at Standing Rock, we were being policed by our own family. The people who showed up in riot gear, let me remind you, right? They weren't like just showing up as themselves. They were showing up in riot gear, were our cousins, they were our uncles, they were our siblings, they were our dads. These are quite literally our family members. In fact, many of the people who showed up had a genealogical relationship to this Mauna. And so, yes, that makes the kind of interaction we're having different. But I think it's important to like parse out the difference between there is a strategy to send Hawaiian cops to police Hawaiian people. But let's not also forget that there's a large number of Hawaiians who decide to become police officers, right? That's only possible because there are so many Hawaiians who move into that profession, which is to say, the removal of Native people from our land, for whatever reason, can never be made anything other than extractive, can never be made anything other than violent. And while the violence we're experiencing does not look like necessarily the violence that was experienced at Standing Rock, the violence that is being experienced by Indigenous and people of color around Turtle Island, there is still on the base layer an issue with the institution and the practices of policing. And so the way that I like to break it down for my students and for people who may not be ready to have conversations around abolition, I start with the idea of property, right? So Chuck Lawrence, who's a brilliant legal scholar, Black legal scholar, lives in Hawaii, great ally to our people. He writes specifically about the beginning of Western law being rooted in the sanctity of property. And this is the intersection by which Indigenous people and Black people experience the violence of colonialism, and in particular policing, right? The removal of natives from our land and creating property out of our ancestor. And then of course, the removal of Black people from Africa, creating property out of their bodies. Because of this, it's important to recognize that the systems and the structures that make possible the murder of unarmed Black men, women, children, and trans people across Turtle Island and in my home territory in Hawaii are the same systems and structures that allow us to think that it is appropriate that police officers can remove Native people from a road that is on Native land for the movement of construction vehicles. How does this all tie together? Well, the first thing is we have a big hurdle to overcome, in particular in the Hawaiian community. And the first one is that we have been conditioned to think of Hawaii as exceptional when it comes to race and racism. We have been conditioned to think of Hawaii as a racial paradise, a multicultural haven, if you will, right? These are things we were told from the time we were children, like racism is an America problem, not a Hawaii problem. Well, the first thing I need to say is like, that just isn't true. Hawaii being illegally overthrown and occupied is an issue of race on top of every other issue of race that we experience here. So that's like the first hurdle. We need to get people to pay attention that racial relations aren't all that different in Hawaii. And then the second hurdle is generally as a population, we need to get people to value human life and life of ʻāina, which Hawaiians will say is human life, right? There is no separating my life from the life of my land, is more valuable than property. So yes, like I'm an abolitionist. I think that, I don't think there's a way to reform police to not be violent. I don't think there's a way to reform prisons that don't completely undermine my, like, the ethics of my people and of my people. What was I going to say? I totally lost my train of thought. Oh, but I also think it's not just about police. It's about capitalism, right? This is the other thing we're sharing between the issues in these movements. It's like the glorifying and making sacred of capitalism and property. And so what we really need here is for people to make the connections between all of these seemingly desperate issues. We've got Hawaiians who are willing to call out capitalism as being bad. We've got Hawaiians who are willing to call out the military as being bad. We've got Hawaiians who are willing to call out the police as being bad. We've got Hawaiians who are willing to call out white supremacy or patriarchy as being bad. But for some reason, oftentimes we can't get all these Hawaiians in the same room to say this is all actually the same issue. And to me, when I pay attention to what's happening with Black Lives Matter, when I pay attention to Native movements to protect land and water, that's one of the struggles a lot of us are having, is making these connections, that they're all really the same, and they're all about ending Native and Black life. To a certain extent, right? And so why wouldn't we want to scrap those things that won't serve us and build and honor institutions that will bring us life instead? So that's what I'll say about that.
That's so important. I think I've heard it said before that abolition, I think Ruth Wilson, this is a Ruth Wilson Gilmore quote, that abolition requires only that we change one thing out of all these issues, that we change everything, and that we just change everything. And abolition is a movement for humanization. All humanization.
And Ruth Wilson Gilmore will remind us, like, our whole conception of crime and property, how all those things are strategically created to make villains out of folks who are suffering, right? When we think of who are the people who are exceptionally policed and prisoned. I don't think prisoned is a verb, but I just made it one, right? We think about people who don't have their essential needs met. Don't have their essential needs met. They don't have food, they don't have housing, they don't have access to healthcare. So when a 16-year-old boy in Hawaii, a Chuukese boy, right, his family has been driven out of their territory because U.S. militarization, right, because we bombed the hell out of their territory, somehow finds his way and his family's way to Hawaii, and then he is murdered because he's driving a stolen vehicle. And the 4 or 5 other boys in the car, 3 of them are unsheltered people. Then we need to be able to see the connections between what the underlying problem here. It's not a problem with crime, right? It's a problem with not establishing a community where we have genuine security and genuine safety, where we actually meet the needs of our people. And that's one of the really profound things about the pu'uhonua, pu'uhuluhulu, and one of the really terrifying things about our movement to the state. It's not that we were blocking a telescope, right? At the end of the day, I think very few people really care that much about the telescope. It's that we showed an alternative way to live, right? In a week, we could feed, house, educate, offer healthcare, both like emotional and physical healthcare, and kind of like cultural education to thousands of people in a state that hasn't been able to do that since its inception, right? So how is that not abolition, right? Gilmore will tell us, right? Abolition is about, it's not an absence, right? It's a permanent presence. It's a creative process. The pu'uhonua was a process towards abolition. But don't tell anyone I said that, because they'll get really mad at me.
No, I think that's great. I think the protection of the Mauna is such a good example of abolition in that sense, but not just abolition, but for people who are not familiar, the building part, the creative part, taking care of each other part, I think is so amazing, and one of the most special things. Okay, I guess we'll move on to another question. I'm going to let Stephen ask this next question.
Thank you, Lily. So the question 4 is: Indigenous people everywhere have a special connection to land and place. Recently, movements to protect and give land back to Native people are rising in support. I think it's hard for non-Native people, settlers, to understand our connection to our ancestral lands and the importance of Aloha ʻāina. Can you speak to what Aloha ʻāina means to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you just look up the 2 words Aloha ʻāina in any Hawaiian language dictionary, right, you'll get love, care for, connection to, and then ʻāina, of course, is that which feeds, or specifically land. I was going to say food. Sorry, I'm hungry. That which feeds and or land. So on its simplest term, Aloha ʻāina means to love your land. If we dive a little bit deeper, right, if we look at old Hawaiian language newspapers from even as early as just after the overthrow, 1895, Joseph Navahi, who was a fierce Hawaiian freedom fighter, it's my best way of describing him in English. He describes himself as an Aloha ʻāina, so that's another thing, like an Aloha ʻāina is a freedom fighter. He describes Aloha ʻāina as a magnet. And this magnet is, it is drawing you in connection to your land. And it is a force so powerful, you cannot ignore it. You cannot overcome it. It will always, always, always pull you back to your ʻāina. But what it will also do, in the words of Navahi, is that it will inspire you to fight for your right to self-govern. That love for land is also a political thing. It's not just an emotional thing, right? And feminists, in particular, Black feminists and Indigenous feminists, they always remind us the personal is political, right? So that which is drawing me personally to my land is also politically drawing me towards fighting for the rights of my land and my people. And then he goes further. He says, if you hold one of these aloha ʻāina magnets close enough to another, right? So if you take an aloha ʻāina like me and you put me in the same room as another aloha ʻāina, maybe, you know, Malia Hulaman, my partner, you put us in the same room, we don't even know each other. The aloha ʻāina in us is going to bind us together. That we are going to recognize aloha ʻāina in each other, and we will be made pili, we will be made intimate. And to me, that's the center of aloha ʻāina. It is the way that we love our people and our land simultaneously. And in fact, it's the way that the land itself holds our love for each other. So what does that look like, right? Well, on the Mauna, right, when we went to Mauna Kea, we told everyone we were coming to protect the mountain, right? Ku kia I Mauna, stand and protect the mountain. I'll see you on the Mauna, I'm gonna go protect the mountain, right? We were articulating over and over our relationship to the place, Mauna Kea. But when we got there, we started protecting each other in a way that we hadn't protected each other in my whole lifetime, right? We put our bodies between construction equipment and police officers and the mountain, but we also held each other as we put our bodies there, right? When they bring out a sound cannon, we take the last earphones out of our pocket and we hand it to the woman next to us. Right? We take when they like show us their tear gas canisters, we like pull the extra bandana out of our pocket and we hand it to the person next to us. When someone was struggling emotionally, we embrace them. And so one of the things I learned, and one of the things everyone, I think, on the Mauna who was there long enough learned, is that to protect your land is to protect each other, that it is the same thing. Which means, right, for people who really struggle with, well, there's a lot of people who struggle with the whole land back thing because people don't like giving up their privileges, even when they recognize that their privileges have been granted to them at the expense of others, right? That you are benefiting from the suffering of other people. People don't like to give up anything. So there's that problem. But people also, even like people who believe that the environment is important, right? We're living in the middle of, or maybe the beginning, I don't know, we're somewhere on this timeline of a climate catastrophe, depending on where you're standing in this moment, right? If you're standing in the Marshall Islands, you may say, now we're in the thick of it, this ain't the beginning. If you're privileged like me and you're standing in the center of Oahu, you're saying, it's coming. But even people who are paying attention to the climate often aren't making the connection between the climate and people. And if you love your land enough to stay there until it is swallowed by the ocean, you also love your people enough to stay there and to never forsake them. And so our movements to protect land, our movements against oil pipelines, our movements against any kind of pollution to our resources, our movements to return land to Native people always have to be centered in the people, because the people are the descendants of the ʻāina. And so the last thing I kind of will say about this question is that, you know, a lot of people ask me, usually it's like the last question in a panel, maybe it's coming today, is like, how can we help, right? How can we stand from our own position and support the work of Native Hawaiians or support the work of people in your own backyard? The first thing I'll tell people is that if aloha ʻāina is like a three-way relationship between land and your people, then your entry as a settler, as an ally, is not to go straight to the land. It's to go to the people. And it's to build a relationship with the people who have been displaced from their land, the people who are closest to that land genealogically and politically, and to establish that relationship, because they will take you back to the land in a way that is ethical, right? That's how everyone can help. And sometimes people have a hard time with that answer because they're like, well, I'm so far away from Hawaii. How do I develop a relationship with Hawaiians? Well, what I'm actually saying is the issue in Hawaii is the same issue that's in your backyard. So just go develop a relationship with the Native people in your backyard. And go develop a relationship with the Black organizers in your backyard, right? Because it's the same work. yeah, so I'll leave it at that before I get too much into the weeds. But that's what a ʻāina is. It's a commitment. It's a dual commitment that you make to both Native people, and I would extend that to like people of color, but specifically Native people and the land that you live on. And if you're not willing to fully invest in that commitment, both of those commitments, then you're not doing a ʻāina. You're doing something else. It may not be like the worst thing in the world that you're doing, but it's not a ʻāina.
Yes, thank you for your mana'o, Dr. Osorio. That was really, really powerful and insightful. But for now, we'll move on to the next question. It will be asked by Sarah Olson, Kanaka Maoli's second-year undergraduate student studying societal and environmental studies and public policy. So I'm going to hand it off to Sarah to ask our next question.
Yes, well, I just want to first start by saying thank you so much for being here. Listening to you speak is so incredibly powerful, and I feel so just lucky to be able to be in this space and be here. And my question is, as Kanaka students in academia, it's all too common for us to feel isolated and underrepresented and sometimes just invisibilized. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience with finding your voice and your power in academia and how we can translate that into empowering and uplifting our young Kanakas that are following.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. Mahalo, Sarah. So how do I answer this question best? Yes. First of all, I want to affirm your question. Yes, as a Kanaka in academia, even in Hawaii, it can be incredibly isolating, and your experience with academia can feel really extractive. You know, some scholars call this like ethnographic entrapment, where like you're supposed to be like this expert on all things Native or Native Hawaiian because you're the only one in the room. Like there's all these processes happening that are incredibly isolating. I was really lucky, I'll have to say, because my answer is informed by this. You know, I grew up with a professor for a father. So even with all the ways that mainstream education was obviously not made for Hawaiians, at the end of the day, like I came home to a man who was teaching in the university who looked like me and he spoke Moʻolelo like me. And so I knew there was some place for us. And I know most, in fact, Hawaiian students don't have that. So one of the first things I would say is finding the right mentors and the right kind of like Indigenous allies and professors in your area is really, really important. When I was at Stanford, the first few years I was there, I had a really hard time because, you know, there were actually quite a few Hawaiians when I was there. Well, it felt like quite a few because like 9 of us got in from my high school. But they weren't really my people. I was like way too radical for the Hawaiians who got into Stanford. We were just very different. So I didn't feel like I really had my people there. The larger Native community was super cool, but I'm like super shy. So I didn't really feel like it didn't feel like my place in a lot of ways. And so one of the things that really helped is I found a brilliant Indigenous professor, scholar, Shuri Moraga, who was like the right amount of radical and the right amount of queer. And I just took every single class I could with her. It didn't matter what I needed in my schedule. Like every semester I took a class with Shuri Moraga because she reminded me just by being there that there was a space for Indigenous people in the classroom. She didn't even have to be Hawaiian, right? There was a space for like non-femme Indigenous, queers in the classroom. More than that, you also need to not be like super shy like me and hide in a corner. You have to create community with other Native students, and those won't always be Native Hawaiian students. In fact, hopefully there'll be other students native to the Pacific, because sometimes Hawaiians, we have this weird like Hawaiian exceptionalism going on and we don't see ourselves connected to other Native people. I don't know, forget about those guys. They'll figure it out at some point. But find the Tongans and the Samoans and the Maori and the Micronesians and the Papuans, right? I don't know how many folks from the Pacific are at Berkeley, probably not too many, but at UH, right? Like you can find those connections as well. And remember at the end of the day, like, yeah, this institution was not made for you, which means in many ways it's not supposed to feel comfortable. And a part of our work This is also something I learned from Chuck Lawrence, who I mentioned earlier. He writes an article called Passing and Trespassing in the Academy, right? So there's the work we do to pass, you know, to get the pala, to get the piece of paper. And we're great performers, right? Native people, and I don't mean that in a facetious way, like we're really great at doing what needs to get done to like get through. And so that's a part of the work. And that work can be really difficult. It can feel self-alienating and all of that. But the other part of the work is, how are you going to trespass in this place? How are you going to change the institution that you're in so that it's not the same in 10 years when another Hawaiian is stepping into this space? Because if we're not going to change it, I'm not sure why we're here, right? The job is not just to get through so that you can like pass and succeed in all the ways that Western scholarship, whatever, all the ways that Haole people have told us we need to succeed. The goal is to get in and like make a mess. And a part of that can be done on campus doing like specific student organizing. A part of it is going to be done kind of from the outside, you know, kind of direct action kind of things against your university. But all of it is actually both about making the space more hospitable to you, but also more hospitable to the people who come next. And I think like the last thing to remember is like, you're not in this alone. Even if you feel that you don't have a strong community around you, like in that moment, you're a part of a genealogy, which means you're never alone, right? Which means someone was there before and someone is coming after. So one of the things I learned from people like Ko'okai Kanuha about like being an ancestor today is that we're always accountable to who's coming after. And there are ways to move and think and live that that recognize that the people who are coming after are actually already like within you, right? And so like there's a community there too. But yeah, like long story short, like F up your university. Because they don't know what they're doing. And half the time they got the wrong people teaching the wrong classes, and they're not hiring the right people to teach the right classes. And the like, I don't know, the centers that were set up to like advocate and offer you resources are ignoring the fact that you even exist. So like, don't be afraid to F up the university. And you guys already know this. I mean, you go to Berkeley, like Berkeley students are the best at effing up their university. So pay attention to that larger genealogy of resistance, you know, Black students in struggle and other Native students in struggle. Yeah.
Thank you. I think me and Carly and Sarah are just nodding so hard. We're like, yep, you know, you're looking at the Kanaka in this Zoom, the students, and this is us. Thank you so much for that. I think your point about having a mentor is so important. And at Cal, in my experience, we have one Pacific Islander professor, Tongan woman, Professor Fuifui Lupe Niumetolu. So amazing. I'm taking her class this semester, and also the perfect intersection. It's called Gender, Sexuality, and Race and Global Political Issues. And she's the amount of radical and queer that I definitely need. And it's been an amazing experience to actually feel what a sliver of inclusion and belonging can feel like in a classroom where you're learning someone that's Pacific Islander and a member of Oceania. So,
you know, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but like one of the things that I personally don't hear our students talking about enough, and like student organizers talking enough, is how to push the university for specific hires, right? Like this is your university. You're paying money into this public institution to be educated. And there's a long history, like you can look at the establishment of ethnic studies departments and so on and so forth. There's a history of students pushing for both departments and hires that would serve them. That you have one professor who's indigenous to the Pacific is a travesty in a state that is overflowing with Pacific people. So like, I know you guys have a lot on your hands, but don't feel like you can't be in a position to like directly push for hires of folks who would represent your interests, especially now. I don't know how the UCs are doing this in like the face of COVID, right? But our university is like frozen hiring and like doing all this ridiculous stuff. But it's always a good time to remind them that they aren't actually fulfilling the institutions promise, depending on who they're hiring. Because if there's only one Pacific Islander professor, then every single Pacific Islander is going to that professor. That's too much, right? Both for you and for them.
Yes, definitely. I don't even know if I'm allowed to say this, but we are definitely pushing for that on the university level. And it's probably the biggest, I feel like me and Carly and a lot of people in the Pacific Islander Initiative, we're blessed to have Angel as our other program coordinator and our other Pacific Islander mentor on campus for us students. But hiring and the creation of a PI studies program, which is our long-term goal, is met with the most resistance, I would say, at the university level.
Probably because it would be the most transformative, right? That's usually a good sign too. Yeah.
Well, we don't give up.
Yeah, don't give up.
Or definitely, I just wanted to add on to that. You know, Lily and I are also on the committee that we've talked with the chancellor and everything about creating more programs and hiring more staff or professors just in general. And I think it's an ongoing fight, and we're still fighting for that. But I just want to say, you know, mahalo for everything that you've spoken about. I also wanted to bring up, I think I had the pleasure of meeting Koho'oka'i Kanuha in 2015 in high school, and he was also such a powerful speaker. And then to your point on academia, you know, I think we've all felt this way, kind of erased and visibilized within academia. And this kind of reminded me of a work from Hananike Trask, and I'm thinking of From a Native Daughter. And that's just, yeah, she's a wonderful, wonderful writer. But anyway, I wanted to move on, just quickly shifting gears, since we talked a little bit about COVID as well. The next question is, how has the role of the kia'i and the struggle on the ground changed in the last year because of COVID-19, and what conflicts have arisen, you know, in trying to protect our lahui and protect the Mauna because of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's any surprise that COVID's changed almost everything for everyone. On like face value, are the challenges, like the day-to-day challenges people are facing, are heightened, right? I mean, most of our people in Hawaii, in particular, like a high percentage of Hawaiians, were already living paycheck to paycheck. So an economic crisis like COVID is really, really damaging, and really terrifying to a lot of our people. And so that's the first way I think things have changed. The other thing is, like, when you're like in the middle of a revolution, and I don't care if anyone else thinks this, like, I'm just gonna believe we're in the middle of a revolution, because it's too dark and scary if not that. Like, what is this if we're not in the middle of a revolution? It's really hard to have ethical, productive, uncomfortable conversations when you're not face to face. It's really, really hard to do that work. And that is really like, if you talk to any organizers, right, most of the work is the personal stuff, is like, let's get on the same page, let's debrief this action, let's figure out how to move forward, because we're like not in a good emotional space. Having to take all of that online, in particular, and looking like at when the puhonua officially closed in March of 2019, there still is a lot of unresolved emotional baggage that a lot of us carry from that time. I mean, when you're living under like constant threat of militarized police, there's just a lot that comes up. And because of COVID, most of us have not been able to address any of that baggage with each other. So that's one of the things that's changed, is like, there's definitely an emotional strain, an emotional toll of the disconnection that COVID has inspired. But I also think COVID-19 I personally don't think COVID-19 has changed much about, how do I say this in a way that I mean? So like, everything seems really different economically, ethically, racially, genderly, queer, all those things, right? It seems really different, but actually I think COVID just made more things visible. I don't think it changed that much. It made a lot of these inequities and failures of our states really, really visible and really, really hard to ignore. And so with that, there's an opportunity for us to step in and show how we can meet those needs, right? To show how like this is not a need that just popped up because of a pandemic. Like these people were already hungry and living in unfair conditions before there was a pandemic. How does that change the way that we have to organize? How does that change the things that we need to be paying closer attention to? So I think that's some of the positives that's come out of such a horrific last year, is that a lot more of those things are made visible. And when they're made visible, we can do something about them, or we can bring more people into the conversation. We can make more connections. But we know that like a pandemic doesn't stop the police. A pandemic doesn't stop construction vehicles. A pandemic doesn't stop the legislature from doing all kinds of out-of-pocket, ridiculous things. And so a pandemic can't stop us. And so in a lot of ways, like our hands are even more full than they have ever been. But this is the world that we live in. And so I think we have an opportunity, and I don't know, maybe this diminishes as time passes on because it's been a whole year and we haven't really, at least like our state certainly hasn't lived up to any of its promises of what we could have done in the last year. But we always had the opportunity to come out better than before, right? We had an opportunity to re-envision Hawaii's economy. We had an opportunity to re-envision land allocation. We had an opportunity to re-envision, healthcare, to re-envision wages, all of these things, right? We had all this opportunity, but what it required of us is to see beyond the pandemic, right? And this is what Native people have been saying forever, is like, you need to be able to see all the way into the past and 7 generations into the future. But when the people who are making your decisions are only thinking in fiscal years, they don't have the courage or the vision, right? When we say, e homai ike pāpālua, right? In na o makua, we're talking about this double or multitudinous vision, this ability to see beyond ourselves. We need to make decisions from a place of courage and belief in what is beyond 2021, right? We need to look into 2031, 2041, 2051, 3051. How are the decisions we're making today going to impact generations down the line? And so I think COVID has us asking these questions. And I'm hopeful, because I know we may think we're done with COVID, but she's not done with us. She's sticking around for a while. We still have a chance to come out better than we started, but it's going to take a lot more from all of us.
Mahalo, I think that's so important. I think a lot of us, like, the work that we do is fueled by 7 generations from now and thinking about the future. And that's so important to our people. Well, we don't have any time for any other questions. Mahalo nui loa, Dr. Osorio, for joining us today. We're so honored that you could be here, and we're so grateful.
Aloha ʻāina.
Aloha ʻāina.
Aloha. Eo. Eo.
Eo.
Eo. Eo.
This is her Hawaiian Pledge of Allegiance every day.
Yay.
Yeah. So, e Hawaii kuone hanau kuome kulai vine. O ni pau ina pono o lahani e ala. Okay, so mahalo.
Mahalo, everyone.
Mahalo yaʻoi.
Mahalo Heoli. E ola.
Mahalo.
Eo.
Eo.
Kukia i Mauna. Mahalo.
Mahalo. Ahui ho.
Ai, aloha.